Rain hammered against the towering, reinforced titanium glass walls of the Valerius Private Aviation Hub, a monolithic structure of steel and shadow sitting at the rain-swept edge of Seattle. Inside, the massive vaulted space smelled of white orchids, polished mahogany, and the faint, intoxicating edge of jet fuel. It was the signature scent of a terminal designed exclusively for the untouchable elite billionaires, foreign dignitaries, and aerospace titans. The floors were cut from seamless Italian marble, reflecting the cold architectural lighting above like a mirror. Through the heavy sliding glass doors walked a man who did not belong. Michael Carter's heavy boots left faint, muddy prints on the flawless stone. His faded olive drab field jacket, worn at the elbows and carrying the distinct, damp smell of wet earth, stood out like an open wound in the pristine, hushed lounge. Slumped against his shoulder was his 6-year-old daughter, Emily. Her small, exhausted breaths puffed softly against his neck. In one hand, she fiercely gripped a tattered brown teddy bear missing its left eye. In the other hand, Michael held a single, slightly bruised white lily. It was the 3rd anniversary. The white lily was the last of a dozen they had laid at the military cemetery on the edge of the city, standing in the freezing rain for 2 hours just to whisper into the wind against a cold marble headstone marked Anna Carter. Michael had carried his daughter 3 miles when their ancient truck broke down on the flooded highway, promising her they would make their flight. Across the terminal, the atmosphere was freezing for an entirely different reason. Catherine Hayes, CEO of Valerius Aviation, moved through the VIP lounge like a perfectly forged blade. Draped in a flawless charcoal trench coat, her heels clicked with the precise, intimidating rhythm of an executioner. A half-dozen nervous executives trailed a step behind her, terrified to speak out of turn. Catherine was known throughout the aerospace industry as the Ice Queen, a woman who dismantled rival airlines in the boardroom without blinking and fired vice presidents for a single stutter. She was brilliant, fiercely guarded, and perfectly empty. Control was her religion. As Catherine swept past the central atrium, her dark eyes flicked toward the entrance. She saw the mud. She saw the frayed canvas jacket. Her jaw tightened, a silent, automatic command forming on her lips to instruct her security detail to clear the vagrant from her flagship terminal. But then, she saw the way the man held the child. His hand was broad, heavily calloused, but it cradled the back of the little girl's head with a protective tenderness that made Catherine's chest inexplicably tighten. For a fraction of a second, the billionaire CEO stopped walking. The executives behind her nearly collided with each other, holding their breath. Catherine felt a sudden, sharp ache beneath her ribs, a terrifying flash of vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to feel in over a decade. Surrounded by millions of dollars of security and wealth, she suddenly felt entirely hollow, looking at the quiet, unshakable warmth radiating from this stranger. Who was this man? Why did his utter stillness suddenly make her empire feel so fragile? She quickly snapped her gaze forward, violently burying the crack in her armor, and disappeared into the glass VIP elevator without saying a word. Michael walked slowly toward the primary departure desk, his eyes scanning the flight boards. Behind the glowing blue onyx counter stood Jessica Moore. Her uniform was razor sharp, her blonde hair pulled into a severe, immaculate twist that looked painful. She was currently handing a platinum-embossed boarding pass to a venture capitalist, offering a blinding, practiced smile that vanished the absolute second the executive turned his back. Michael stepped up to the counter. Jessica's eyes dropped to his muddy boots, traveled up the cheap, wet denim, and settled on the bruised white lily in his hand. Pure, undisguised contempt rippled across her perfectly contoured face. "Sir," Jessica said, her voice dripping with glacial, polite disgust, "I think you are incredibly lost. The commercial terminal for budget airlines is 3 miles down the highway. There is a public shuttle bus outside, assuming you have cash." Michael didn't raise his voice. He shifted Emily gently, adjusting his shoulder so the harsh terminal lights wouldn't hit her eyes. "I'm not lost," he said, his tone low, steady, and carrying an underlying rumble that demanded quiet attention. "I need to confirm one seat on the midnight transport to DC." Beside Jessica, a younger agent named Ryan Cole let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He leaned lazily against the onyx counter, crossing his arms and looking Michael up and down. "The midnight transport? Buddy, the landing fees alone for the jets out there cost more than your life insurance payout. This is Valerius Elite. We don't sell tickets to the public." This terminal is strictly for private owners, military contractors, and executive board members. I'm aware of where I am, Michael said, his expression completely unchanging. Check the manifest for Flight 404. Just type the name. Jessica rolled her eyes, her manicured fingers hovering over the glass keyboard but absolutely refusing to touch the keys. I will not waste my time or insult our high net worth clients by putting a street vagrant into our encrypted system. You are tracking mud onto imported marble. Leave this desk right now, or I will have you physically removed. 50 feet away, by the private security checkpoint, an older guard named George stood completely paralyzed. His silver hair caught the dim blue lights of the scanner. He was gripping his radio so tightly that his knuckles had turned bone white. George had served in the air cavalry 20 years ago. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He knew the face of the man standing at the desk, and he knew the terrifying weight of the silence radiating from him. George's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He took a single, desperate step forward, opening his mouth to stop Jessica before she ruined her entire life. But Michael caught the movement in his peripheral vision. Without turning his head, Michael locked eyes with the old guard and gave a barely perceptible, razor-sharp shake of his head. "Hold the line, George." George froze. His throat worked violently. He slowly lowered his head, closed his eyes, and stepped back into the shadows, his hands shaking. At the sound of Ryan's mocking laughter, Emily stirred. The harsh voices had finally pulled her from her exhaustion. She rubbed her brown eyes with a small fist, looking around the massive, terrifyingly clean room. She looked at Jessica's glaring face, then at the dying flower in her father's hand. "Daddy?" Emily's voice was tiny, trembling as it echoed in the vast space. "Why is that lady looking at us like we're dirt? Did we do something wrong?" Jessica sneered, leaning aggressively over the counter. "Yes, sweetie. You are ruining the atmosphere of a very expensive building." She picked up her radio, her eyes flashing with cruel triumph. "Mr. Reynolds to the front desk. We have a trespasser who is refusing to leave." Michael's expression didn't change, but the temperature in his eyes dropped to absolute zero. The quiet, grieving father vanished. In the span of a single heartbeat, something incredibly dangerous woke up. The silence that fell over the front desk of the Valerius Aviation Hub was sudden and suffocating. It was not the quiet of an empty room, but the terrifying stillness that precedes a hurricane. The polite, grieving father in the muddy field jacket was gone. In his place stood a man whose sheer, unmoving presence seemed to drain the oxygen from the air. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He simply stared at the two young agents behind the blue onyx counter, and the air around him grew instantly, impossibly heavy. Ryan Cole's mocking laugh died in his throat. He shifted his weight, suddenly hyper-aware of the expensive silk tie around his neck, feeling absurdly fragile under the weight of the stranger's gaze. The young agent tried to maintain his arrogant smirk, but the muscles in his face betrayed him, twitching nervously. He took a slow, involuntary half-step backward. Jessica Moore felt the shift too. Her perfectly manicured fingers, which had been aggressively hovering over her keyboard, slowly curled inward. Panic, sharp and unfamiliar, flared in her chest. She hated the feeling. She was the gatekeeper to the most elite clientele in the world. She controlled who moved through this terminal, but looking into the cold, dark depths of the stranger's eyes, she felt like prey. Desperate to regain control, Jessica snatched the two-way radio clipped to her tailored blazer. "George," she snapped, her voice pitching slightly higher than usual. "George, I need security at the primary desk immediately. We have a hostile trespasser. Bring the restraining cuffs." 50 feet away, half hidden in the shadows of the marble archway, the old security guard closed his eyes. Sweat beaded on his weathered forehead. He listened to Jessica's shrill demand echoing through the earpiece. His hand trembled as it rested on his heavy tactical belt. He knew exactly what the protocols were. He knew he was supposed to march over there, put his hand on the man's shoulder, and escort him out. Instead, George reached down to his radio. With a slow, deliberate motion, he twisted the volume dial until it clicked off. The tiny green light on the device went dark. He stepped further back into the shadows, pressing his spine against the cold stone pillar, praying that the storm about to hit the terminal would pass over him. At the desk, Jessica waited. The radio remained silent. Only the faint hiss of static replied. "Where is he?" Jessica hissed under her breath, her polished facade cracking. She slammed the radio down on the marble counter. Before she could reach for the emergency silent alarm, heavy, measured footsteps echoed across the floor. Marcus Thorne, the director of ground operations, strode toward the desk. Marcus was a man who wore his authority like a weapon. Dressed in a bespoke slate-gray suit, he projected an aura of absolute impatience. He dealt with foreign princes and demanding tech billionaires. He had zero tolerance for whatever this muddy distraction was. "What is the delay here, Jessica?" Marcus demanded, not even looking at Michael yet. "We have a board member arriving in 20 minutes and the lobby smells like wet grass." "Mr. Thorne," Jessica said, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and venom. This man wandered in from the street. "He is demanding a seat on a private transport and refusing to leave. Security isn't responding." Marcus slowly turned his head, finally looking at the man in the faded canvas jacket. He took in the bruised white lily, the worn boots, and the little girl hiding her face in her father's neck. A look of profound disgust settled over Marcus's sharp features. "Listen to me very carefully, pal," Marcus said, his voice a low, threatening drawl. "I don't know how you slipped past the gate, but you are currently standing on private property. If you do not turn around and walk out those glass doors in the next 5 seconds, I will have the Port Authority drag you out in chains. Are we clear?" Emily flinched at the harshness of the man's voice. She pressed her face deeper into the rough fabric of her father's coat, her tiny shoulders shaking. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "The loud man is scary. Let's just go. Please." Michael did not look at Marcus. He completely ignored the operations director. Instead, he did something that made the entire lobby freeze. Right there, in the middle of the pristine, high-security terminal, Michael slowly sank to one knee on the imported marble. He shifted the bruised lily to his other hand and gently took his daughter's tear-stained face in his calloused palms. He didn't care about the billionaires. He didn't care about the threats. He only cared about the terrified little girl in front of him. "Hey, look at me, Emmy," Michael murmured, his voice suddenly stripped of all the ice, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth that filled the empty space between them. "Remember what we talked about when the thunder gets loud?" Emily sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. She nodded slowly. "The loudest thunder is just empty air," she whispered back. "Exactly," Michael said, offering her a soft, reassuring smile that seemed to exist only for her. "It's just noise, sweetheart. It can't hurt you. I am right here. Nothing in this room is going to touch you, I promise." High above them, standing on the glass-floored mezzanine overlooking the lobby, Catherine Hayes had stopped walking. The CEO of Valerius Aviation had been rushing toward a critical merger meeting, surrounded by her entourage of anxious executives. But looking down through the floor-to-ceiling glass, she had been stopped dead in her tracks. Catherine's dark, commanding eyes were fixed squarely on the man kneeling on the floor. She watched the way his large, rough hands cradled the little girl's face. She heard the faint, distant echo of his deep voice floating up through the cavernous terminal, the absolute, unshakable safety he offered his child. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers, wrapped tightly around an expensive leather portfolio, suddenly began to tremble. She was a woman who commanded fleets of aircraft, a woman who terrified grown men in boardrooms. She had wealth, power, and absolute control. But looking down at that muddy, exhausted father, a sickening wave of realization washed over her. She realized with devastating clarity that she had never felt as safe in her entire life as that little girl did right now. No amount of money had ever bought her that kind of peace. "Miss Hayes?" one of her vice presidents asked nervously, stepping up beside her. "We really must proceed to the boardroom." Catherine did not answer. She could not tear her eyes away from the scene below. Down at the desk, Marcus Thorne had lost the last shred of his patience. Being ignored made the blood rush to his face in a hot, furious wave. He stepped closer, invading Michael's space. "Get up off my floor," Marcus snarled, pointing a finger directly at Michael's face. "I want your identification right now. I am putting your name on the permanent federal blacklist, and then the police are taking you away. Give me your ID, now." Michael finished wiping a stray tear from Emily's cheek. He stood up slowly, rising to his full height. He looked at Marcus Thorne with a gaze so entirely devoid of fear it was unnerving. Without saying a word, Michael reached into the inner pocket of his worn, damp jacket. He bypassed his leather wallet. Instead, he pulled out a solid, heavy black metal card. It had no name printed on it. It had no corporate logo. It had no picture. It was just a cold slab of matte black metal with a single magnetic strip. He tossed it onto the blue onyx counter. It landed with a heavy, expensive thud. "Swipe it," Michael said quietly. Marcus let out a short, derisive breath, snatching the heavy metal card off the counter. "You think some fake VIP card is going to impress me?" he mocked. "Let's see exactly who you are." Marcus gripped the card and aggressively dragged it through the high-security terminal reader attached to the desk. The system beeped once. Then, the massive blue onyx display screen at the desk flickered. The standard flight schedules vanished instantly. The Valerius corporate logo dissolved. The entire screen went completely dead black. A second later, a solid, pulsing red warning frame appeared around the edges of the monitor. Marcus Thorne stared at the screen. The mocking smile melted off his face, replaced rapidly by the pale, bloodless color of sheer terror. The pulsing red light from the onyx screen cast a bloody, rhythmic glow across Marcus Thorne's pale face. The terminal system, a multi-million-dollar encrypted network designed to process the wealthiest individuals on the planet, had completely frozen. All the flight manifests, luxury departure schedules, and corporate logos had vanished, replaced by a single, unblinking red frame. There were no words, no error codes, just that terrifying, absolute crimson border. Behind the desk, Jessica Moore stopped breathing. She took a slow step backward, her manicured hands trembling. She had worked at Valerius Aviation for 4 years and had processed royal families and cartel-adjacent billionaires. She had never seen the system do this. Marcus stared at the heavy black metal card in his hand. His mind raced, desperately trying to construct a reality where he was still in control. He was the director of operations. He did not bow to men in muddy boots. "Where did you get this?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into a furious bark. He slammed his hand flat on the marble counter. "This is a shadow tier override. These don't exist outside of the Federal Defense Registry." "You stole this." Michael did not blink. He stood perfectly still, his broad shoulders shielding his daughter from the glare of the terminal lights. "Run it again," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in the quiet lobby. "And this time, let it finish." Marcus's face twisted into an ugly mask of wounded pride. "I am not running stolen military credentials through my terminal. I am locking this building down." Without waiting for authorization, Marcus violently slammed his palm against the emergency security panel hidden beneath the desk. He didn't hit the silent alarm. In his panic, he hit the catastrophic lockdown override. Instantly, a deafening, mechanical siren tore through the hushed elegance of the terminal. The ambient white lighting snapped off, replaced by sweeping, aggressive red strobes that bathed the Italian marble in a terrifying emergency glow. Heavy steel security shutters began to descend over the massive glass walls with a horrifying metallic grind. The refined, tranquil atmosphere of the VIP lounge shattered into absolute chaos. Venture capitalists dropped their champagne glasses. Executives shouted, diving toward the exits. High up on the glass-floored mezzanine, the sudden, violent noise was catastrophic. Catherine Hayes' 5-year-old son, Julian, had been quietly walking 10 paces behind her, holding the hand of his au pair. He was a deeply sensitive child, easily overwhelmed by noise, entirely unsuited for the high-pressure, abrasive world his mother ruled. When the sirens erupted and the red strobes began to flash, Julian screamed. It was a raw, terrified sound. He ripped his hand away from the nanny, covered his ears, and bolted blindly toward the grand glass staircase. "Julian!" Catherine screamed, her commanding CEO facade completely shattering in an instant. She dropped her 6-figure leather portfolio, papers scattered across the glass floor like dead leaves. She sprinted toward the stairs, her heels slipping dangerously. She reached the bottom landing just as Julian collapsed onto the cold marble floor, curling himself into a tight, trembling ball. He was hyperventilating, his small chest heaving violently, his eyes squeezed shut against the blinding red lights. Catherine fell to her knees beside him. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Julian, look at me. Look at Mommy," she pleaded, grabbing his small shoulders. But her voice was sharp, frantic, laced with her own rising panic. She was a woman who solved global supply chain crises without raising her pulse. But looking at her terrified son, she was entirely, utterly helpless. She shook him slightly, her perfectly manicured hands rigid with fear. "Stop crying, please!" Julian, you have to breathe. Please. Her desperation only made it worse. Julian shrieked louder, batting her hands away, entirely consumed by the sensory overload of the alarms. Catherine looked around wildly, her dark eyes wide and pleading, hoping one of her highly paid executives would know what to do. They all stood frozen, useless, terrified to intervene. She had billions of dollars in assets, and it meant absolutely nothing. She could not save her own son from his fear. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. Michael had left the ticketing desk. He had gently set Emily down on a nearby leather bench, telling her in a soft, unshakable voice to stay exactly there. He walked straight through the flashing red lights, entirely ignoring the two armed security guards who were now sprinting across the lobby toward him, tactical batons drawn. He knelt on the floor opposite Catherine. "Don't touch him." Catherine snapped, her protective instinct flaring, her voice trembling violently. Michael didn't look at her. He didn't look at her wealth, her flawless clothes, or her panicked authority. He kept his eyes entirely on the little boy. His movements were slow, deliberate, and incredibly grounded. He didn't reach out. He didn't shout over the alarm. He simply sat cross-legged on the cold stone, took the bruised white lily from his pocket, and held it out, resting his heavy, muddy boots on the floor. "Hey, buddy," Michael said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a strange, resonant frequency that somehow cut cleanly through the blaring sirens. It was a voice that had calmed terrified men in the darkest, most dangerous corners of the world. "You hear that loud noise? It's just a machine throwing a temper tantrum. It doesn't know how to use its words." Julian's breath hitched. He cracked one tear-filled eye open, peeking through his fingers at the muddy stranger holding a dying flower. "This flower is tired, just like you," Michael murmured, his brown eyes warm and impossibly steady. "Can you help me wake it up? I need a really deep breath. Blow the petals for me. Let's show that loud machine how quiet we can be." Michael inhaled slowly, exaggerating the rise and fall of his chest. He was a mountain of calm in the middle of a hurricane. Julian stared at the lily. Slowly, his tiny, trembling hands lowered from his ears. He looked at Michael's calm face. Children understand safety on a primal level, and in a room full of panicked billionaires, this muddy stranger was the only safe place. Julian took a shuddering breath, leaned forward, and blew on the white petals. "Good man," Michael whispered, offering a small, genuine smile. Again, Catherine knelt there, entirely paralyzed. Her chest heaved as she watched her son's frantic breathing slow to match the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man in the faded jacket. The contrast was devastating. She was rigid, cold, and frantic. He was warm, patient, and effortlessly protective. In less than 30 seconds, this stranger had provided the emotional security she had spent her entire life trying to buy. A profound, shocking ache bloomed in her chest. Before she could speak, heavy boots pounded against the marble. Marcus Thorne arrived, flanked by 3 heavily armed Valerius security officers. He was sweating, pointing a trembling finger at Michael. "Get away from the CEO's son!" Marcus roared over the sirens. "Officers, this man triggered the lockdown with a stolen federal card. Put him in cuffs right now!" The officers lunged forward, grabbing Michael by the shoulders of his canvas jacket and violently wrenching his arms behind his back. Michael did not fight them. He let himself be pulled up, his eyes never leaving Julian, ensuring the boy saw he was calm. Catherine stood up slowly, her shock morphing into something entirely different. But before she could order the guards to release him, the blaring sirens abruptly cut off. The red strobe lights froze. The entire terminal went dead silent. Behind Marcus, the massive 40-foot digital departure board that spanned the length of the lobby suddenly snapped to life. But it didn't show flight times. The giant screen glowed bright, blinding white, and massive black text began to scroll across it, triggered by the card Marcus had swiped. Every head in the terminal turned upward, and a collective gasp echoed through the marble hall as the true identity of the cardholder finally loaded into the system. The massive digital departure board spanning the length of the Valerius aviation hub did not show flight times. The screen flared with a blinding white light that completely washed out the remaining shadows in the lobby. Across the 40-foot display, massive black letters began to lock into place, one by one, accompanied by the heavy, mechanical sound of absolute system confirmation. Global, lockdown, override. Clearance level, Omega Prime. Defense contractor recognized. Horizon Advanced Systems. Welcome, Chief Architect and Founder, Commander Michael Carter. The silence that hit the terminal was heavier than the blaring sirens had been. It was the sound of 100 wealthy, powerful people simultaneously stopping their breath. The two armed security guards who had violently grabbed Michael by the shoulders froze. They looked up at the towering screen. Then they looked down at the man in the muddy field jacket they were currently restraining. The color instantly drained from their faces, leaving them looking like polished stone. With synchronized, terrifying realization, both men released Michael as if his canvas jacket had suddenly caught fire. They stumbled backward, hastily holstering their batons and lowering their heads. Michael did not look at the giant screen. He did not look at the terrified guards. He did not look at the stunned executives staring at him from across the marble floor. He calmly rolled his broad shoulders, adjusted the collar of his frayed jacket, and looked down at 5-year-old Julian. The little boy was no longer crying. He was sitting quietly on the cold floor, holding the bruised white lily in his small hands, looking up at Michael with total awe. "You see that?" Michael said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the dead silent room. He offered the boy a soft, genuine smile. "You blew the pedals, and the loud machine finally decided to behave. You did a great job, buddy." A few feet away, Catherine Hayes was still kneeling on the floor. The ice queen of the aerospace industry was completely paralyzed. Her mind was spinning violently, trying to reconcile the impossible reality in front of her. Horizon Advanced Systems. Every single person in the aviation world knew that name. They were the undisputed giants of aerospace engineering, the shadow developers who built the engines that powered every elite private fleet on the planet, including hers. And everyone knew the legend of their founder. A former military commander. A genius who held patents that governments killed for. A man who had completely vanished from the public eye 3 years ago after a sudden catastrophic personal tragedy. Catherine stared at the muddy boots. She stared at the faded jacket. This was the ghost. This was the man her board of directors had been desperately trying to secure a 5-minute phone call with for 18 months, and she had almost let her staff throw him out into the freezing rain. More devastating than the business implications was the painful, burning reality in her chest. She looked at her son. Julian, who screamed around strangers, who hid from her own executives, was sitting calmly on the floor with a man who looked like a vagrant. This muddy stranger had given her son the absolute safety she had been entirely incapable of providing. This is a cyber attack. The panicked, furious scream shattered the silence. Marcus Thorne was standing behind the blue onyx desk, his bespoke suit ruined by nervous sweat. His face was twisted into a mask of pure denial. He refused to believe it. He could not be humiliated like this in front of his staff. He pointed a trembling finger at Michael. "He hacked the system!" Marcus yelled, his voice echoing shrilly. "That is a stolen military card!" "Officers, I gave you a direct order. Subdue that man and put him in cuffs right now." The two security guards did not move an inch. They stared at Marcus as if he had lost his mind. Marcus slammed his hand on the desk, turning to the terrified desk agent. "Jessica, call the Federal Port Police. Tell them we have a domestic terrorist in the building." Jessica Moore was trembling so violently she could barely stand. She took a massive step away from the desk, shaking her head, her perfectly manicured hands covering her mouth. She wanted to disappear into the floor. "I will do it myself," Marcus snarled, ripping his radio from his belt. Before Marcus could press the transmission button, a heavy, unyielding hand clamped down on his wrist. It was George. The elderly security guard had walked all the way from the shadows of the checkpoint. He stood perfectly straight, his shoulders squared, an aura of quiet surrounding him. He gripped Marcus's wrist with a surprising, bone-crushing strength. "You will put that radio down, Mr. Thorne," George said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute weight of a man who had seen real war. Marcus gasped, trying to pull his arm back. "Get your hands off me, George! You are fired!" George did not let go. "That man is Commander Michael Carter," George said slowly, staring directly into the operations director's panicked eyes. "I served in his flight division 20 years ago. He is a Medal of Honor recipient. He owns the navigation patents that allow this terminal to legally operate. And if you speak to him with disrespect one more time, you will not need the police. You will need a hospital." Marcus's jaw dropped. The radio slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the Italian marble floor. He looked at George, then looked at Michael, the reality finally crushing the last of his arrogant delusion. Michael ignored the confrontation entirely. He walked slowly across the lobby to the leather bench where his daughter was sitting. Emily had watched the entire chaotic scene with wide, tired eyes. Michael crouched down, wrapping her small coat tighter around her shoulders. "You okay, Emmy?" he asked softly. Emily nodded, wrapping her arms around his neck as he lifted her effortlessly against his chest. "I told them you were a good guy, Daddy," she whispered. "I know you did, sweetheart," Michael murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Let's get out of this noisy room." Michael turned toward the massive glass doors leading to the private tarmac. He did not ask for permission. He simply began to walk. The crowd of wealthy executives instantly parted for him, stepping back as if a king were walking through their ranks. "Mr. Carter, please, wait." The voice was breathless, stripped of all its corporate armor. Catherine Hayes stood up. She abandoned her expensive portfolio on the floor. She took 3 hurried steps forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble. The ruthless CEO of Valerius Aviation looked at the single father in the muddy jacket, her dark eyes filled with a desperate, vulnerable sincerity she had never shown anyone. "I need to apologize," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly in the quiet room. "To you and to your daughter." Michael stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He stood looking out at the rain hammering against the glass, the weight of 1,000 untold stories resting on his broad shoulders. Then, very slowly, he turned his head to look at her. Michael did not turn around immediately. He stood looking out at the torrential rain hammering against the reinforced glass of the Valerius Aviation hub. The weight of 1,000 untold stories seemed to rest on his broad, damp shoulders. Then, very slowly, he turned his head to look at Catherine Hayes. The ruthless CEO of the aerospace empire was entirely stripped of her corporate armor. She stood amidst the scattered papers of her dropped portfolio, her expensive trench coat wrinkled, her dark eyes filled with a desperate, vulnerable sincerity. Michael looked at her, then lowered his gaze to the little boy sitting quietly on the marble floor. Julian was still clutching the bruised white lily, his breathing finally steady. "You do not owe me an apology, Miss Hayes," Michael said, his deep voice carrying a quiet, resonant truth that seemed to echo in the cavernous lobby. "I am used to rooms full of people who think money makes them bulletproof." "But he isn't." Michael nodded gently toward Julian. "Power does not mean anything," Michael continued softly. "If it cannot make your own child feel safe, you cannot buy peace. You have to be the peace." Catherine felt the air leave her lungs. It was the truest, most devastating thing anyone had ever said to her. She looked at the muddy stranger, then looked down at her son. Her throat tightened painfully. Without caring about the staring executives or her ruined posture, Catherine sank to her knees on the cold floor and pulled Julian into her arms. She held him fiercely, burying her face in his small shoulder. For the first time in a decade, she was not a CEO. She was just a terrified mother who had almost lost her son to his own fear. The moment of quiet vulnerability was violently shattered. The heavy steel emergency doors leading from the active tarmac burst open with a deafening crash. A ground operations chief, drenched in freezing rain and completely out of breath, sprinted into the lobby. Water pooled on the flawless Italian marble beneath his heavy boots. "Miss Hayes!" the chief shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "The grid is completely down!" The lockdown override shorted the heavy-duty moorings on Apron 3. "The midnight transport to DC is unsecured." Catherine's head snapped up. The color drained instantly from her face. "What do you mean unsecured? Engage the secondary brakes." "The wind sheared the tug line," the chief yelled, pointing wildly toward the massive glass walls overlooking the runway. "The storm is pushing the jet across the tarmac. It is loose, and the wind is dragging it straight toward the subterranean fuel mains. If the landing gear strikes the ventilation pipes, the spark will ignite the entire eastern depot." The terminal erupted into absolute hysteria. The wealthy elite, the venture capitalists, the untouchable billionaires, they all instantly lost their refined composure. The elegant VIP lounge turned into a stampede of sheer animal survival. People screamed, dropping expensive luggage and pushing each other toward the primary exits. The thin veneer of high society completely vanished in the face of imminent, fiery death. Behind the blue onyx desk, Marcus Thorne stepped backward, shaking his head in absolute denial. "We have to evacuate," Marcus stammered, his bespoke suit drenched in nervous sweat. "Call the fire department! We cannot go out there! The wind will kill us!" He was completely, utterly useless under real pressure. Catherine stood up, clutching Julian to her chest. She was the CEO. She was the leader of this empire. She was supposed to issue the orders. But looking out through the rain-streaked glass into the pitch-black night, seeing the faint strobe lights of a multi-ton luxury aircraft sliding dangerously across the wet concrete in hurricane-force winds, she froze. She looked at her highly paid executives. They were running away. She looked at her security team. They were paralyzed. She held her young son tightly, feeling the terrifying, crushing weight of absolute helplessness. All her billions of dollars, all her influence could not stop that jet from destroying the terminal. Michael Carter took a slow, deep breath. The quiet, grieving single father completely dissolved. In the span of a single heartbeat, the elite military commander woke up. The man who had operated in the deadliest, most unforgiving environments on Earth took command of the room without raising his voice. He turned to the older security guard. George was already standing at attention, his eyes locked on his former commander. "George," Michael said, his voice cutting cleanly and calmly through the chaotic screams of the crowd. "Take my daughter to the upper mezzanine. Keep her away from the glass. Do not let anyone near her." "Yes, Commander," George said without a fraction of hesitation. He stepped forward and gently took Emily's small hand. Emily looked up at her father. She did not cry. She did not panic. She had seen him fix broken things her entire life. She simply nodded, trusting him with absolute, unwavering faith. Michael walked directly toward the emergency doors. "Mr. Carter, wait!" Catherine screamed over the deafening noise, her voice raw with genuine fear for him. "You cannot go out there! The wind is at 70 miles an hour. The Port Authority is coming." Michael did not even break his stride. By the time they get here, this entire terminal will be a crater. As he passed the frozen, trembling Marcus Thorne, Michael reached out and snatched the heavy emergency radio and a thick steel hazard tether from the wall kit. He hit the manual release for the tarmac doors. The wind violently ripped the doors open, throwing a sheet of freezing rain into the lobby. The roar of the storm was deafening, a howling wall of sound. Without looking back, Michael stepped out into the black, chaotic night. Catherine rushed to the glass wall, shielding Julian's eyes with her coat but entirely unable to look away herself. Outside, the sheer force of the storm was terrifying. The massive luxury jet was sliding laterally across the slick concrete, its immense weight acting like a sail in the brutal wind. 50 yards away, the heavy steel grates of the fuel depot ventilation pipes were completely exposed. Michael ran. He did not stumble against the wind. He moved with a calculated, predatory grace that seemed impossible in the brutal weather. The freezing rain instantly soaked through his faded canvas jacket, plastering his dark hair to his forehead, but he did not slow down. Catherine watched, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She had spent her entire life surrounding herself with the most powerful men in the world. Politicians, tycoons, industry titans. But watching this man risk his life in the freezing dark, simply because it needed to be done, she realized none of those wealthy men possessed a single fraction of the raw, unyielding strength he did. Michael reached the moving aircraft. He dove straight under the massive undercarriage, disappearing into the dark, crushing space between the towering tires and the slick concrete. "He is going to be crushed," the ground chief whispered in absolute horror, standing beside Catherine. "The gear is going to roll right over him." Catherine stopped breathing. She pressed her bare hand against the freezing glass. The massive jet groaned, sliding closer and closer to the fuel lines. The gap was closing rapidly. 40 yards, 30 yards, 20 yards. Suddenly, a massive, deafening metallic slam echoed over the howling storm. Sparks showered violently from beneath the aircraft, burning bright orange against the dark, driving rain. The multi-ton jet shuddered violently. The tires screamed against the wet concrete, locked in place by an impossible force. The aircraft stopped moving. It rested exactly 15 feet from the fuel depot grates. The blinding sheet of freezing rain battered the massive glass walls of the terminal, but inside, no one moved. 100 of the wealthiest people on the planet stood completely frozen, staring out into the dark. Beneath the multi-ton luxury aircraft, the shower of bright orange sparks finally died out. The terrifying groan of twisting metal ceased. The jet sat motionless, anchored to the wet concrete a mere 15 feet from the fuel depot grates. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was no movement from beneath the aircraft. Catherine Hayes pressed both of her hands flat against the freezing glass. Her breath fogged the pain. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard it physically hurt. The CEO of Valerius Aviation, a woman who controlled a global empire, felt a tear slip down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just stared at the massive black tires, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. Then, a shadow shifted. From the dark, crushing space beneath the landing gear, a figure pulled himself out into the driving rain. Michael Carter stood up slowly. His faded canvas jacket was soaked through and torn at the shoulder. His hands and arms were coated in thick, black aviation grease. He looked exhausted, battered by the hurricane-force winds. But as he turned back toward the terminal, his posture was as straight and unyielding as forged steel. A collective, shuddering breath echoed through the entire lobby. Michael walked back across the tarmac, the storm raging around him as if it didn't even exist. He reached the heavy emergency doors, gripped the manual release, and pulled them open. The howling wind tore into the room for one brief second before the heavy seals slammed shut behind him, cutting off the storm. Water poured off his clothes, pooling on the flawless Italian marble. He wiped a streak of dark grease from his forehead with the back of his forearm. His chest heaved slowly, steadily. He did not look for praise. He did not look at the billionaires staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. He only looked up at the glass-floored mezzanine to ensure the old security guard had kept his daughter safe. He had. George stood at the top of the stairs, holding Emily's hand, tears streaming openly down the old soldier's weathered face. "You destroyed the landing gear." The frantic, high-pitched scream shattered the awe in the room. Marcus Thorne shoved his way through the stunned crowd. The director of operations was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and manic. He pointed a trembling finger at Michael, desperate to regain a fraction of the power he had just lost. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Marcus yelled, his voice cracking. "You jammed the primary struts. That is a $60 million aircraft. You voided the warranty. I am going to see you locked in a federal prison for the rest of your life." Michael turned his head slowly. The look in his dark eyes was so deeply cold, so terrifyingly calm, that Marcus physically stumbled backward. Before Michael could speak, the massive glass doors at the front of the terminal slid open. A team of heavily armed Federal Aviation Defense officers stormed into the lobby. They wore black tactical gear, their boots echoing sharply against the marble. Leading them was a tall, imposing man in a pristine charcoal overcoat, Director Vance of the Federal Port Authority. Marcus let out a gasp of pure relief. He ran toward the heavily armed team. "Director Vance," Marcus shouted, waving his hands frantically. "Thank God you're here. This man is a domestic terrorist. He used a stolen military card to trigger a lockdown, and he just vandalized a private jet on the tarmac. Arrest him." Director Vance did not even look at Marcus. He kept walking, his eyes locked straight ahead. Vance walked past the terrified executives. He walked past the massive, glowing blue onyx desk. He walked directly up to the man in the torn, greasy canvas jacket. Director Vance stopped. He snapped his boots together and delivered a crisp, flawless military salute. "Commander Carter," Vance said, his voice ringing with absolute, unquestioning respect. "Horizon Command detected the Omega-level override. The perimeter is fully secured." "Awaiting your orders, sir." The entire terminal stopped breathing again. Marcus Thorne's mouth fell open. His arms dropped to his sides. He looked at the heavily armed federal officers, all standing at strict attention, waiting for the muddy man in the torn jacket to speak. Marcus realized, with a sickening, crushing finality, that the giant screen glowing above them was not a glitch. The man he had tried to throw out into the rain was the architect of the very airspace they stood in. Michael looked at Director Vance. "Keep your men at the doors, Vance. No one leaves until the storm passes. The jet is secured, but the tarmac is unstable." "Understood, Commander," Vance replied sharply. Michael finally turned his attention to Marcus. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His voice was a low, devastating rumble that carried to every corner of the silent lobby. "Mr. Thorne," Michael said softly. "The landing gear is jammed because I manually drove a titanium tether pin straight through the hydraulic calipers. If I hadn't, that $60 million aircraft would be inside the ventilation shafts of a 1,000-gallon fuel depot right now." Marcus trembled so violently his knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the blue onyx desk to keep from collapsing onto the floor. "You do not possess the emotional control required to protect human life," Michael continued, stepping slightly closer. "When the sirens went off, you panicked. When the jet broke loose, you froze. You wear a very expensive suit, Mr. Thorne, but underneath it, you are a complete coward." Director Vance turned to his officers. "Confiscate his corporate credentials. Escort him to the holding area. He is no longer authorized on this premises." "Wait! Please!" Marcus begged, tears of pure humiliation springing to his eyes as two massive federal officers grabbed him by the arms. Miss Hayes, tell them I am the Director of Operations. Catherine Hayes had been standing perfectly still, watching the entire exchange. Her dark eyes were fixed on Michael. When Marcus called her name, she slowly turned her head. The Ice Queen looked at her former employee with absolute zero sympathy. You were the Director of Operations, Catherine corrected softly. Take him away. As Marcus was dragged sobbing toward the back corridors, a tiny pair of footsteps echoed across the marble. Julian had wriggled free from his mother's side. The 5-year-old boy ran straight across the room, completely ignoring the federal officers and the staring billionaires. He slammed into Michael's legs, wrapping his small arms around the man's damp, grease-stained knees. Michael immediately dropped to a crouch. He didn't care about his ruined clothes, and he didn't care about the grease on his hands. He kept his dirty palms turned away, using his forearms to gently hug the little boy back. We stayed quiet, Julian whispered, looking up with wide, adoring eyes. The loud machine stopped. I know, buddy, Michael smiled. The dangerous military commander vanishing instantly, replaced once again by the warm, patient father. You were incredibly brave. Catherine slowly walked over to them. She looked down at the billionaire defense contractor kneeling on the floor in muddy boots, comforting her son. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled slightly. The thick, unshakable walls she had spent a lifetime building around her heart were completely gone. Catherine Hayes lowered herself to the cold marble floor. The immaculate, terrifying CEO of Valerius Aviation did not care that her designer skirt was soaking in a puddle of rainwater and aviation grease. She did not care that 100 of her wealthiest clients, board members, and executives were watching her. She only cared about the little boy clinging to the chest of the muddy stranger. She reached out, her hands trembling violently. Michael looked up at her. His face was streaked with dirt and exhaustion, his breathing still heavy from the impossible strain of stopping the aircraft, but his dark eyes were completely soft. He didn't see the billionaire. He just saw a terrified mother. Very gently, Michael shifted his weight. He placed one large, calloused hand on Julian's back and guided the 5-year-old into Catherine's waiting arms. Julian grabbed his mother's neck, burying his face in her shoulder. Catherine let out a breathless, broken sob, pulling her son against her chest as fiercely as she could. She squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face in his hair, overwhelmed by the crushing realization of how close she had come to losing everything that actually mattered. Thank you, Catherine whispered, her voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual commanding edge. Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. You don't repay a man for doing what he is supposed to do, Michael said quietly. His voice was a low, steady rumble that anchored the chaotic room. He needs his mother right now. That is all that matters. Michael slowly pushed himself off the floor, his ruined canvas jacket dripping onto the marble. Director Vance stepped forward, his posture rigid with absolute respect. Commander Carter, the storm is escalating to a Category 3. The Port Authority has officially grounded all flights out of the Pacific Northwest. We cannot clear the midnight transport to DC for takeoff. The airspace is completely locked down until morning. Michael closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. A deep, heavy shadow crossed his face. It was the first time all night he had shown any sign of defeat. He looked toward the upper balcony, where George was holding Emily's hand. Understood, Vance, Michael said, his voice dropping slightly. Thank you. Catherine stood up, holding Julian against her hip. She wiped her eyes, her mind finally shaking off the terror and returning to the present. She noticed the profound sadness that had just settled over the military legend's face. We have the executive penthouse suites on the top floor, Catherine said, stepping toward him. Her tone was no longer transactional. It was pleading. Please, your daughter is exhausted. You are freezing. Let me offer you a safe place for the night. It is the absolute least I can do. Michael looked at her. He saw the genuine desperation in her eyes, the desperate need to offer him something, anything, in return for her son's life. He nodded slowly. 10 minutes later, the blinding red emergency strobes and the chaotic noise of the terminal were completely gone. The Valerius Executive Penthouse was a sanctuary of silent luxury. Deep mahogany walls, soft amber lighting, and floor-to-ceiling soundproof windows that turned the raging hurricane outside into nothing more than a silent movie. In the massive living area, Emily and Julian were sitting together on a plush white rug. The terror of the lobby was already fading from their young minds. Julian was carefully showing Emily his collection of expensive wooden airplanes, and she was introducing him to her battered, one-eyed teddy bear. Catherine stood in the doorway of the kitchen, holding a warm towel. She had changed out of her ruined clothes and wore a simple, elegant cashmere sweater. The thick armor she wore to survive the cutthroat corporate world was completely gone. She watched Michael. He was standing by the massive window, looking out at the black, rain-swept tarmac. He had removed the heavy, grease-soaked canvas jacket, leaving him in a fitted, dark gray tactical shirt that clung to the heavy muscle of his shoulders. Even standing entirely still, he radiated a quiet, protective power that made Catherine's chest tighten. She walked over slowly and offered him the towel. He turned, accepting it with a soft nod. "Thank you." Catherine wrapped her arms around herself. She had negotiated billion-dollar defense contracts with foreign governments without her heart rate rising. But standing alone with this man, she felt entirely exposed. "Why were you flying commercial?" Catherine asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The system identified you. You are Horizon Advanced Systems. You own the patents to half the private fleets in the world. You could have commanded a private escort, but you were standing at the public desk in a torn jacket, letting my staff treat you like dirt. Why?" Michael wiped the rain from his face. He looked back out the window, his jaw tightening. "Because when my wife died 3 years ago, I walked away from all of it," Michael said, his voice thick with an old, unshakable grief. "The money, the company, the influence. None of it could save her. I took Emily, and we learned how to live quietly." Catherine felt a sharp ache in her heart. She stepped slightly closer. "But you came back tonight. You asked for the midnight transport to DC." Michael looked over his shoulder at his daughter, who was smiling as Julian handed her a wooden jet. "Tomorrow is the anniversary of her mother's passing," Michael said softly. "My wife is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. For 3 years, Emily and I have lived off the grid, but I made a promise. I promised my daughter that when she turned 6, I would take her to see where her mother rests. I promised I would lay a white lily on her grave at sunrise." He looked down at his bruised, calloused hands. "But my truck broke down on the highway. We missed the public flights. I broke my own rule and tried to use my old clearance just to keep a promise to a little girl. And now, the airspace is closed. I failed her." Catherine's breath caught. She looked at the bruised white lily, still sitting on the polished glass coffee table where Julian had carefully placed it. She realized why he had stayed so calm. She realized why he hadn't fought back against the insults. He wasn't a billionaire trying to prove a point. He was just a heartbroken father trying to keep a promise to his child. Catherine looked at him, and a fierce, unexpected fire ignited in her chest. "Excuse me for one moment," Catherine whispered, her voice suddenly trembling with a new kind of adrenaline. She turned and walked swiftly into the private study, closing the heavy mahogany door behind her. She picked up the encrypted silver phone on the executive desk. She didn't care about the storm. She didn't care about Port Authority regulations. She was Catherine Hayes, and she owned the sky. Catherine stood in the dimly lit study of the penthouse, the encrypted silver phone pressed hard against her ear. On the other end of the secure line was the Secretary of Defense, a man who routinely made foreign diplomats and tech billionaires wait weeks for a 5-minute meeting. She did not ask for a favor. She dictated. "I need a federal aviation corridor cleared out of Seattle to DC." "Immediately," Catherine said. Her voice dropped into the absolute ruthless authority that had built the Valerius Empire. But this time, there was a desperate, protective fire behind it. "I don't care about the Category 3 lockdown. I don't care about the civilian ground stop. You owe Valerius 3 massive logistics favors from the Pacific Fleet contract last year. I am cashing all of them in right now." There was a long, heavy pause on the line, then a tired sigh. "Catherine, it's a hurricane. The only things flying in the Pacific Northwest right now are military medevacs and coastal rescue. It is impossible." "Then classify it as a rescue," Catherine replied, without missing a single beat. Her dark eyes drifted to the cracked mahogany door of the study, watching Michael Carter gently adjust a blanket over his sleeping daughter on the sofa. "Because it is." The morning sun broke through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, casting long, golden shadows across the quiet room. The raging winds had finally died in the early hours of the morning, leaving behind a sky of fractured, brilliant blue. Michael was already awake. He was sitting on the edge of the leather sofa, slowly tying the laces of his muddy boots. His canvas jacket was completely ruined, slung heavily over the back of a chair. He looked out at the quiet, sunlit city, the crushing weight of the missed anniversary settling heavily on his broad shoulders. He had survived impossible combat deployments, built a shadow empire in aerospace engineering, and walked away from all of it. But failing to keep a simple promise to his 6-year-old daughter was a quiet defeat he did not know how to carry. "Good morning." Michael turned his head. Catherine stood in the hallway. She was dressed in a simple, elegant, dark wool coat. Her hair was pulled back loosely. The sharp, intimidating, untouchable edge of the Ice Queen was entirely gone. She looked completely human. She looked beautiful. "Morning," Michael said softly, his deep voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "The storm finally broke. We should get out of your hair. I'll take Emily down to the public terminal and see if anything is flying out by noon." Catherine shook her head slowly. She walked over to the massive glass window and looked down at the sprawling Valerius tarmac below. "You aren't going to the public terminal, Michael." Michael frowned slightly, standing up to join her at the glass. Down below, sitting precisely in the center of the secure VIP apron, was a sleek, matte black Valerius Phantom, the most advanced, heavily armored private transport in the world. It was Catherine's personal flagship aircraft. Surrounding the jet was a full ground crew, moving with urgent, flawless precision. Standing at the base of the boarding stairs, dressed in a sharp new tactical operations uniform, was George. Michael stared at the aircraft. The engines were already spooling up, a low, powerful whine vibrating faintly through the thick glass. He recognized the specific heat signatures of the exhaust. They were completely prepped for an immediate hot start takeoff. "The civilian airspace is still locked down," Michael said, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "The Port Authority won't clear any private flights for another 24 hours. Catherine turned to face him. Her dark eyes met his, and for the first time she allowed him to see the absolute, unguarded depth of her respect. "Civilian airspace is closed," Catherine said softly. "But federal emergency corridors are open. I made a few phone calls. Your flight plan is logged as a critical defense contractor transport. Director Vance has already secured your departure window. You leave in 10 minutes. Michael stepped back, completely stunned. He looked at the billionaire CEO, realizing exactly what she had just done. She had burned massive political capital, risked her own company's federal standing, and leveraged her entire corporate empire, all for a single, bruised white lily. "You didn't have to do this," Michael whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Catherine stepped closer. The space between them completely vanished. She looked up at the broad, scarred shoulders of the man who had risked his life in the freezing rain to save her son, the man who had brought total peace to a terrified little boy when her billions of dollars could not. "You told me last night that you can't buy peace," Catherine murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "You were right, but you can protect it. You protected my son, Michael. This is me protecting your promise." A soft stirring came from the couch. Emily sat up, rubbing her sleepy eyes with the back of her small hand. Her tattered teddy bear was clutched tightly under her arm. Julian peeked his head out from the hallway, still wearing his pajamas, watching them quietly. "Daddy?" Emily yawned. "Are we going home?" Michael walked over and scooped his daughter up into his arms. He held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling a sudden, overwhelming surge of gratitude. "No, sweetie," he said, his voice completely steady, completely warm. "We're gonna see Mommy." 30 minutes later, Michael stood at the base of the boarding stairs on the wet concrete of the tarmac. The freezing rain was a memory, replaced by the crisp, clean air of a new dawn. Emily ran forward and gave Julian a tight hug. The little boy hugged her back, his eyes wide and brave. He wasn't crying. For the first time in his life, surrounded by the massive machines and the roaring jet engines, he felt entirely safe. Michael turned to Catherine. The morning wind whipped her dark hair across her face. She didn't look like a ruthless executive. She looked like a woman who had finally found something real, something worth holding on to. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently taking hers. He didn't shake it. He just held it for a long, quiet moment. The chemistry between them was no longer an unspoken tension. It was a deep, unshakable anchor. "When we get back," Michael said, his dark eyes locking onto hers, "let me buy you a cup of coffee. Somewhere quiet. No boardrooms, no sirens." Catherine's breath hitched. A slow, radiant smile broke across her face, entirely transforming her. It was a smile of pure, unguarded hope. "I would like that very much," she whispered. Michael nodded. He turned and carried Emily up the stairs of the matte black jet. 4 hours later, beneath the sprawling, ancient oaks of Arlington National Cemetery, the afternoon sun cast a warm, golden light across the endless rows of pristine white marble. Michael knelt in the soft green grass. He wore a clean, dark suit he had kept stored on the aircraft. He looked at the engraved letters on the cold stone. Emily stepped forward in her small coat. Her hands gently placed the bruised, travel-worn white lily against the base of the headstone. She patted the marble softly. "We made it, Mommy," Emily whispered into the quiet breeze. Daddy kept his promise. Michael closed his eyes, resting his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. For 3 years, he had carried the crushing weight of grief in total silence. He had built walls of absolute isolation, hiding from the world in faded jackets and muddy boots. But feeling the warm sun on his face and remembering the soft, genuine smile of the woman waiting for him back in Seattle, he realized the storm had finally passed. He opened his eyes, exhaling a long, steady breath. The ghost of his past was finally at peace, and for the first time in a very long time, the quiet, broken father was ready to look forward to tomorrow.